The fifth estimate arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped beneath Victoria Sterling's office door, in a cream envelope that felt almost apologetic in its weight. She did not open it immediately. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her 42nd floor office, overlooking Midtown Manhattan, and watched the snow come down in thick, unhurried sheets, the kind of snow that buried the city quietly, without drama, the way certain problems arrive before a person realizes how serious they have become. The city below her was muffled and slow, the usual noise of traffic and machinery softened under the accumulating white, until even Midtown felt, from this height, briefly and almost tenderly still. She already knew what the number inside the envelope would say. It would be large. It would be confident. And it would be wrong in the same way the 4 before it had been wrong, not in the arithmetic, but in the conclusion. Victoria Sterling did not lose. This was not arrogance so much as it was record. She had built Sterling Prestige Motors from a single import consultancy in her late 20s into one of the most respected luxury automotive dealerships on the East Coast, with showrooms in Manhattan, Greenwich, and Miami, a client list that read like the masthead of a financial magazine, and a reputation for knowing exactly what a certain kind of person wanted before they had the language to ask for it. She was 41 years old, 6 feet tall in her preferred heels, and had the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that visible emotion was a form of currency best spent sparingly. She wore her dark hair pulled back at the office. She answered emails at 5 in the morning. She had not taken a vacation longer than 4 days in 7 years. And she did not apologize for any of this, because she did not believe apology was called for. The business was her argument. The results were her explanation. The world that Victoria occupied was one built almost entirely on the management of impression. The cars she sold were beautiful, and they were engineered with genuine sophistication. But a significant portion of what she was actually selling was something less tangible. The feeling that choosing this car, in this color, from this dealership, represented a decision of taste that could not be made by just anyone. She understood this without cynicism. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in South Philadelphia, the daughter of a garage owner who repaired domestic sedans for families who kept them until the odometer folded twice over, and she had arrived in the luxury market not through inheritance but through the disciplined study of what made one category of people feel recognized and another category feel excluded. She had learned it the way a person learns a second language fluently. Eventually, but always with the faint awareness that it is not the first one. This had made her, over time, unusually effective. She could move between registers, understand both the mechanical and the symbolic, speak the language of the collector and the language of the engineer, and she had built Sterling Prestige on the credibility that this fluency produced. What she had not built, and had not thought to build, was a tolerance for problems that could not be solved by deploying the right expertise at the right cost. The car that was causing her current problem was a gunmetal gray Aston Martin DB, 3 years old, barely 9,000 miles on the odometer, and valued at just under $1 million when options and provenance were factored in. It had belonged to a client of hers who had decided, in the way that very wealthy people occasionally decide things, that he no longer wanted it and would prefer something newer. Victoria had taken it in on trade, had it detailed and inspected, and had decided to offer it as a gift, a gesture, really, in the old tradition of relationships that existed above the transactional to Richard Holloway, a man whose signature on a partnership contract would expand Sterling Prestige Motors into the Chicago and Dallas markets simultaneously. It was not a bribe, it was an introduction, a punctuation mark at the end of a conversation that had been going very well. The kind of thing that, in Victoria's world, was simply done. The test drive had been arranged for a Tuesday in early December. The snow had started overnight, lighter than, just a suggestion. Richard Holloway had arrived at the Manhattan showroom in a charcoal wool coat, with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being shown beautiful things. And Victoria had handed him the key herself, a small ceremony, unhurried, and walked with him to the car. He had settled into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror in that proprietary way people do with machines they are already imagining, owning, and pulled out of the garage into the gray morning light. 40 seconds later, The DB11 had stopped in the middle of West 57th Street. Not slowly, not with warning. It had simply ceased to move, as though the city itself had placed a hand flat on its hood and said, "Not today." Richard Holloway had stepped out of the car with extraordinary composure. The composure of a man who understood that what was happening was not his problem. He had looked at Victoria across the roof of the dead car with an expression she would replay in her mind several times over the following weeks. Not angry, not amused, not sympathetic, purely neutral. The way a man looks at a situation he is deciding whether to involve himself in. Then, he had taken out his phone and called his driver. He did not say anything further to Victoria about the car. He did not have to. The weight of what he didn't say filled the space between them on that snow-dusted street like a third presence. Before he got into his own vehicle, he turned back once and said, simply and without particular emphasis, "Fix it before next Friday." Victoria stood on West 57th Street and watched his car disappear into traffic and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific sensation of pressure that had no immediate solution. The first shop was Meridian Automotive Works on the Upper East Side, a facility that had serviced more European exotics than most dealers ever sell, run by a man named Gregor Schultz, who had 3 certifications on his wall and a handshake that communicated irreversible technical authority. His team spent 4 hours with the DB11 before Gregor called Victoria into the consultation room, wood-paneled, climate-controlled, smelling faintly of leather conditioner, and laid a diagnostic printout across the table, with the careful deliberateness of a surgeon presenting scan results. The transmission was, in his assessment, in a state of advanced internal failure. The torque converter had shed material. The valve body showed pressure inconsistencies across 3 circuits. He quoted $180,000 for a full replacement with an authorized reconditioned unit. He said it with the certainty of a man who had seen this before and expected no argument. Victoria authorized a second opinion the following morning. She sent the car to Atlantic European Motors in Hoboken, a larger operation with a factory-trained Aston Martin technician on staff, a man who had apparently spent 4 years in the brand's UK training program, and whose diagnostic process involved a proprietary software interface that cost more per license than some mechanics earned in a year. His conclusion was nearly identical to Gregor's catastrophic transmission failure, internal damage extensive, the unit beyond economical repair. His quote was $214,000, plus labor at a rate that did not invite negotiation, plus the cost of sourcing a replacement unit from a European parts broker he worked with exclusively. He said the car had likely been driven hard at some point, and the damage had compounded over time the way these things do. Victoria did not argue because she did not yet have the information needed to argue. She went to 3 more shops over the following 10 days, each one more prestigious than the last, each one arriving at the same essential verdict through slightly different paths. The third shop, a facility in Westchester, that serviced the personal collections of 2 former Formula One drivers and a retired technology executive whose net worth required a second decimal point to express, quoted $240,000 and suggested the car might actually be worth more as parts. The fourth, a dealer-affiliated service center in Greenwich, quoted $270,000 and offered to source a factory new unit from Newport Pagnell if Victoria was willing to wait 6 to 8 weeks. The fifth was a specialty transmission rebuilder in Midtown who had performed work on cars that had appeared in international auction catalogs, and he agreed with everyone else in the field, called it a clean-cut case of systemic transmission failure, and quoted $260,000 for a rebuild that would take 90 days minimum. Victoria had the numbers written on a legal pad on her desk. $180,000. $214,000. $240,000. $270,000. $260,000. The column of figures had the grim regularity of a sentence being pronounced 5 times by 5 different judges who had all read the same law. She was not sleeping well. She was waking at 3 in the morning and lying still in her apartment, watching the streetlight move across the ceiling, turning the problem over. The Holloway contract had a soft deadline of December 23rd. Richard's assistant had communicated this through a channel that suggested flexibility, while meaning the opposite. The car could not remain broken. She could not simply write a check for $270,000 for a repair on a car she did not own, and that was supposed to be a gesture. The arithmetic of the situation had become genuinely hostile. It was Sophie Brennan, her executive assistant, 26, sharp and constitutionally allergic to dead ends, who set a folded piece of paper on Victoria's desk late on a Wednesday afternoon without comment. Victoria opened it. Written in Sophie's precise handwriting, Daniel Mercer. Mercer Garage. Winter Creek Road. No phone listed. Below that, in smaller letters, he fixed a Koenigsegg last winter. Nobody else would touch it. Victoria stared at the paper for a long moment. She did not ask Sophie how she found it. Some information arrives through channels that are better left unexamined. She looked back at her column of figures. Then she picked up the paper and put it in her coat pocket. The drive to Winter Creek, Colorado, took her through Denver on a connecting flight, and then south and west into a landscape that widened and whitened the farther she went from the city. She rented an SUV at the airport because someone at the rental counter looked at her shoes and quietly suggested it, and she drove for 2.5 hours through a country that bore no resemblance to the world she operated in. The mountains appeared first as suggestions in the distance, then grew into certainties, enormous and indifferent, their upper elevations already locked in the hard silence of serious winter. The road climbed. The trees thickened on either side, tall Douglas firs carrying snow on their arms like people waiting patiently for something. The radio signal faded somewhere around mile 40, and she drove the last stretch in silence, with nothing but the sound of her tires on packed snow and the occasional whisper of wind pushing through the pines. Mercer Garage was not difficult to find, which surprised her, because it looked like the kind of place that should be difficult to find. It sat back from Winter Creek Road at the end of a narrow, unpaved lane, a low building with a corrugated metal roof and 2 wide bays open to the cold. The overhead doors rolled up despite the temperature. There was no electronic sign, no backlit logo, no architectural language of commerce or professionalism. There was a hand-painted wooden board above the main bay that said Mercer in letters that had faded to the color of old brick. And below that, nothing. No tagline, no phone number, no hours. Light came from inside the garage, the particular warm amber of incandescent work lamps that have been burning in the same place for a long time, and it fell across the snow in the lane in long yellow parallelograms that looked almost deliberate, as though arranged. Victoria parked and sat in the SUV for a moment, with the engine running. She had spent the last 2 weeks in rooms where people told her what was wrong with a car she needed fixed. She was not accustomed to uncertainty about what she was walking into. She turned off the engine and got out. The man inside the first bay was working underneath the rear end of a full-size pickup truck, his legs visible from the knees down, heavy work boots caked with the kind of grease that takes weeks to accumulate. He did not stop what he was doing when she entered, and he did not acknowledge the particular quality of silence that a visitor creates in a working space. She stood in the bay entrance for a moment, the cold following her in from outside, and waited. After perhaps 15 seconds, he rolled out from under the truck on a low dolly, sat up, and looked at her. He was somewhere in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that was not unfriendly, so much as it was unperforming. He did not smile in the reflexive way of someone who wants to be liked. He simply looked at her, wiping his hands on a rag that was already past usefulness, and waited for her to speak. In the small office visible through a half-open door at the back of the bay, a child sat cross-legged on a braided rug in front of a wood-burning stove, her back to the main garage, a sketch pad propped on her knees. She had dark hair in 2 uneven braids and was wearing a sweater with a rabbit on it. She was holding a stuffed rabbit in the crook of her left arm and drawing with her right hand, completely absorbed, as though the noise and cold of the garage were simply weather that didn't apply to her. She looked to be about 7 years old. Victoria introduced herself, explained the car, gave the address of the storage facility in Denver where she'd had it transported. The man listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where's the car?" Victoria told him it could be there tomorrow. He nodded once, and went back under the truck. From the office, without looking up from her drawing, the child said, "There's coffee on the hot plate if you want." Victoria looked at the child, then at the man's boots still visible under the pickup. She said thank you, and meant it in a way she had not expected to. He spent the first day walking around the DB11 without touching it. This was the detail that Victoria could not initially reconcile with what she understood about competence. Every technician she had worked with across her career moved quickly with the confidence of the diagnostically certain. They connected laptops, ran codes, lifted panels, spoke in the declarative tense. Daniel Mercer walked around the Aston Martin 3 times at a measured pace, and then stood still at the passenger side rear quarter for almost 4 minutes, looking at a section of the car that contained nothing remarkable. When Victoria finally asked what he was doing, he said, without looking up, "Reading it." She stayed. She had not planned to. Exactly, she had planned to leave a number and check in by phone, but something about the specific quality of the afternoon made departure feel like a decision she wasn't ready to make. There was a wooden chair near the office door, and she sat in it with her coat still on while the cold worked its way in from the open bays, and Daniel worked in the kind of silence that isn't emptiness but concentration made physical. He asked her questions over the course of the afternoon, but not the questions she expected. He did not ask about the car's service history in the systematic way of a man filling out a form. He asked when she had first noticed the car behaving differently. He asked who typically drove it, and where. He asked whether the previous owner had ever mentioned anything about the car in passing, anything at all, not necessarily mechanical. Victoria answered as precisely as she could, which was imprecisely, because she realized she had not actually paid close attention to the car as an object until it stopped working. Toward 4 o'clock, Lily came out of the back office, carrying a mug in both hands with the serious care of someone transporting something important. She brought it to Victoria without being asked, and set it on the edge of the tool bench beside her chair. The coffee was strong and slightly burnt, and tasted exactly like what it was, which Victoria found unexpectedly comforting. Lily looked at Victoria with the direct gaze of a child who has not yet learned to obscure curiosity with social performance. "Do you have kids?" she asked. Victoria said no. Lily considered this. "Dad says people without kids worry too much," she said, and then went back to her rug and her drawings without waiting for a response. As though the observation was informational rather than critical, Victoria looked at Daniel across the garage. He had crouched beside the driver's side door and was looking at something along the door sill with a small flashlight. Not the door itself, but the gap between the door and the frame, with the focus of someone who has found a thread worth pulling. He still had not connected any diagnostic equipment to the car. He still had not said what he thought was wrong. When Victoria asked him directly, midway through the afternoon, he looked at her over the roof of the DB11 with the flashlight still in his hand and said, "I haven't opened it yet." He said it without apology or elaboration. The way a person states a fact about geography. Victoria sat back down in the wooden chair. The snow outside the open bay had started again, fine and horizontal in the wind. From the back office, the sound of Lily humming something without a discernible melody drifted through the crack in the door, and the wood stove ticked quietly with heat. And Daniel Mercer went back to reading the car. That evening, as Victoria was putting on her gloves to leave for the motel she'd found 12 miles down the road, Daniel looked up from the notes he'd been making in a spiral notebook with a bent cover and said, without preamble, "All 5 shops were partly wrong." He did not elaborate. He went back to his notebook. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment with her gloves half on, then walked to her car through the dark and the snow. She came back the next morning at 7:30, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. She told herself this was because she needed to monitor the situation, which was true in the way that a small truth can shelter a larger one. Daniel arrived before she did each morning, already working when she pulled into the lane, the bays lit and the sound of tools already inside the cold air. He worked methodically, without urgency and without dawdling, with the particular unhurried precision of someone who has made peace with the fact that some things take as long as they take. He spoke occasionally, in short, declarative sentences, not to explain what he was doing but to note observations, the kind of quiet professional narration that is addressed to no one in particular, or possibly to the car itself. There was a radio on the shelf above the second tool cabinet, an old one with a telescoping antenna, and it played country music at a volume that barely cleared the ambient noise of the garage, just present enough to notice on the songs with a quiet middle section. Daniel did not appear to listen to it consciously. It was simply there. The way the wood stove and the braided rug were there part of the texture of the place, rather than a choice made fresh each day. On the third day, Sophie called with the results of a background search she had apparently run without being asked. Daniel Mercer had worked for AMG's Stuttgart facility for 11 years before his name appeared in 3 internal technical reports that had circulated, quietly, among engineers who cared about such things. He had been on the transmission development team for 2 of AMG's most technically complicated dual-clutch systems. A technical paper he had co-authored in German, Sophie, had found a partial translation dealt with pressure cascade failures in automated manual transmissions under thermal stress. He had left Stuttgart in 2018. The record after that was sparse. A return to the United States, a business registration in Mesa County, Colorado. No press. No industry presence. No digital footprint beyond the registration. Victoria listened to Sophie read this back to her and looked through the open garage door at Daniel, who was at that moment in conversation with the DB11's engine bay, moving a small probe across a section of wiring harness with the focused attention of someone conducting a very quiet interview. On the 4th day, Lily asked Victoria if she knew how to draw horses. Victoria said she did not. Lily said she would teach her, and produced a second pencil from the pocket of her corduroy overalls with the efficiency of someone who has made this offer before and considers it non-negotiable. They sat together on the braided rug for 40 minutes, while Lily guided Victoria through the construction of a horse, starting from 2 ovals and a set of straight lines that, in Lily's hands, resolved into something recognizable, and in Victoria's hands resolved into something she described as abstract. Lily studied Victoria's drawing seriously and said, "It looks like a dog that's trying." This was, Victoria thought, one of the more accurate assessments she had received in recent memory. On the 5th evening, Daniel spoke more than he had on any previous day, still not much, but enough. He talked about the car's electrical architecture in terms that were precise and unexpectedly clear. Not simplified, but structured in a way that allowed comprehension without requiring specialization. Victoria found herself actually following the logic, which surprised her. She had spent 2 decades in the luxury car business and had absorbed a great deal of technical language, but this was different. It was engineering described from the inside, the way a person explains something they have not merely studied but understood, at the level where understanding becomes instinct. He spoke a few sentences in German at one point, catching himself, switching back. She didn't ask him about it. Some things earn their context in their own time. On the 6th morning, she arrived to find the garage bay closed and a piece of paper taped to the door. It said, in handwriting that matched his notebook, "Don't come today." Victoria stood in the snow reading it for a moment, then got back in her SUV and drove to the diner in town, where she sat at the counter for 2 hours with coffee and a newspaper she did not read, and then drove back and sat in the parking lot of the motel, watching the mountains in the middle distance go through their afternoon light changes from pale gray to deep blue to the particular purple that precedes total dark. The storm arrived properly that night, the kind of winter storm that doesn't announce itself with incremental buildup but simply appears at full volume, as though the sky had been holding it in reserve. Snow came down thick and fast and accumulated on the SUV's roof in the motel parking lot, while Victoria sat in the driver's seat, with the engine running and the heat on, her phone in her hand. Richard Holloway's assistant had called twice that afternoon, politely phrased inquiries that communicated a deadline without naming one. Richard himself called at 7:45. She answered on the second ring. He asked how things were progressing. She told him they were progressing well. He asked about the car specifically, and she said the car would be ready. He asked by when, and she said before Christmas, and he said, "Good, that was good." And there was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained, in those 3 seconds, the full weight of what the word good meant when spoken by a man like Richard Holloway in that tone of voice, which was, "This is the last extension of goodwill available to you on this particular matter." She said she would be in touch. He said he appreciated that. They said goodbye with the mutual professionalism of two people maintaining the fiction that a conversation had gone well. Victoria set the phone on the passenger seat and looked through the windshield. The snow was coming down so hard that the motel sign 20 feet away was barely legible, just a vague orange blur in the white. She thought about what she had just done, which was to make a promise to a person she could not afford to disappoint, based on the work of a man she had known for 6 days, in a garage she could not have found without a handwritten note from her assistant, in a state she had never previously had occasion to visit. She had told Richard Holloway the car would be ready. She had no technical basis for this. She had no timeline. She had no quote, no formal assessment, no contract. She had a man with dark hair and a quiet manner working on something he had not yet named, and a child who had offered to teach her to draw horses, and a coffee from a hot plate that tasted like a consequence she had not anticipated. The garage was visible from where she sat. She had found, without quite meaning to, a parking orientation that put it in her sight line. The overhead door was still down, but light showed at its edges, a thin, bright seam where the door met the frame, suggesting that whatever Daniel Mercer had started that day, he had not stopped. The light was steady and warm and entirely indifferent to the storm. Victoria watched it for a long time. She thought, this is what trust feels like when it has no evidence to stand on. She was not accustomed to the feeling, and did not entirely like it, and could not, for the first time in a very long time, find an alternative. She had just decided to go inside and sleep when her phone lit up with a text. One line. The sender listed only as the number she'd given him at the start. It said, "Come inside. At 7 tomorrow." She read it twice. Then, she put the phone in her coat pocket and listened to the storm. The garage in the morning had the particular quality of a room that has been worked in all night. The overhead lights were all on, including 2 portable work lamps that had not been present the day before, positioned at angles that turned the DB-11's engine bay into something approaching an operating theater, bright and clinical, and organized with the specificity of intention. The car's hood was fully open. On the rolling tool bench beside it, laid out in a sequence that had the visual logic of a documented argument, were a series of components, wires, and connectors, each on a piece of clean shop rag, each with a small handwritten label and masking tape. The transmission cover had been removed and was standing upright against the wall, and the interior of the transmission itself was visible precise mechanical architecture, gears and shafts and housings, in the particular condition of something that has been very carefully opened and examined, and found to be, mostly, intact. Daniel was at the workbench when Victoria came in, writing in his spiral notebook. He looked up, gestured toward the car with the pen. "Come look," he said. He walked her through it methodically. The transmission was not destroyed. It had not shed material. The torque converter was sound. The valve body was functioning within specification. What 5 of the most credentialed automotive technicians in the northeastern United States had collectively diagnosed as catastrophic internal failure was, in Daniel Mercer's assessment, and, as he made clear with the patience of someone who has waited to be heard, the consequence of a single failed pressure sensor in the oil management system, a component 73 millimeters long, that communicated hydraulic pressure data to the car's engine control unit. When the sensor failed, it had sent the ECU a pressure reading so anomalous that the ECU had done exactly what it was programmed to do. It had locked the transmission protective protocols and disabled the drivetrain entirely. The car had not broken. The car had protected itself from what it believed, based on bad data, was an imminent catastrophic failure. It had been in a state of informed paralysis. The firmware governing this response was a rare variant, installed during a production line update for a small number of DB11 units built during a specific window in the manufacturing calendar. None of the 5 shops had known to look for it because none of them had encountered it before, and because the car's error codes, when read by standard diagnostic equipment, mapped correctly to the symptoms of genuine transmission failure. The diagnosis was, in that sense, a reasonable mistake arrived at by unreasonable confidence. Victoria looked at the sensor lying on its piece of clean rag. It was smaller than she had imagined. It looked like a component that should cost perhaps $40 and take 20 minutes to replace. She asked. Daniel said the sensor itself was $340. The total repair sensor, firmware reset, full system validation would come to $840. He said it the way he said most things, without particular emphasis, as a fact about the world. Victoria stood looking at the sensor for what was probably a full minute. Around her the garage smelled of machine oil and cold air, and something faintly like pine resin from the wood the stove burned. Outside, the storm had spent itself overnight, and the snow was done, and the morning was very clear and very bright, the kind of winter morning that seems, after a storm, to be trying to compensate. She thought about the legal pad on her desk in Manhattan with the column of 5 figures. She thought about the consultation room at Meridian, with its leather smell and its wood paneling, and Gregor Schultz's printed diagnostic report laid flat across the table with the gravity of scripture. She thought about the 4th shop in Greenwich and the 5th man in Midtown. Each of them credentialed and experienced and expensive and, in their separate ways, completely certain. She thought about how certainty, when it arrives from 5 directions at once, has the weight of fact even when it is merely agreement. 5 authoritative voices saying the same wrong thing is not evidence. It is only consensus. And consensus, Victoria had always known in the abstract, without having had recent occasion to feel it concretely, is not the same as truth. The sensor on the shop rag weighed perhaps as much as a house key. It had cost $340, plus the labor of a man who charged less per hour than she spent on lunch on an ordinary Thursday. And it was the entire problem. She looked at Daniel and said, "They all ran the codes. They all saw the same error readouts." He nodded. She said, "And they all concluded transmission failure." He nodded again. She said, "How did you know it wasn't?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen from the workbench and looked at it the way a person looks at something when they are choosing words. Then he said, "You asked what was wrong with the transmission. The right question was, what was wrong with the car?" He set the pen down. The transmission wasn't wrong. The car's information was wrong. If you fix the answer before you find the right question, you're just replacing parts. He said this without triumph, without the particular inflation that people give to insights they are proud of. He said it the way he said most things, as though it were simply how things are. Victoria turned slightly and looked along the wall beside the office door. She had not noticed it before, or had noticed and not focused. A series of photographs tacked to the wall at irregular heights and angles, the casual archive of a life that has been lived in this space for some years. Work photos, cars in various stages of disassembly. A few engine components arranged for documentation, a Koenigsegg she recognized from Sophie's description. And among them, other photographs, a woman with dark hair and a wide, uncomplicated smile standing in a European city square in summer. Her arm around a man who was clearly a younger Daniel Mercer, thinner and more open-faced, Lily at perhaps 2 years old, asleep in a car seat. A hospital photo. A woman in a hospital bed, still smiling. And then other photos of Lily without the woman, Lily growing incrementally in the images, Lily on a bicycle, Lily with a dog, Lily in this garage, sitting on the same braided rug. Victoria did not say anything. She looked at the photographs for a moment, and then looked back at the DB11. She asked him, that afternoon, how long he had been in Winter Creek. He said 6 years. She asked about Stuttgart. He answered with the brevity of someone who has given this information before and found it sufficient. 11 years, specialized in transmission systems, particularly failure cascades in high-output dual-clutch environments. He had been considered, among the people who considered such things, someone worth arguing with about this specific problem, which in that world constituted a form of recognition. Victoria asked if he had left by choice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sarah died in the spring of 2018. Cerebral aneurysm. She was 37. He said it without embellishment, without the conversational softening that people usually apply to this category of information, and the absence of that softening made it land with more weight than embellishment would have. Lily was 18 months, he said. I chose Lily. Victoria sat with that for a moment. The wood stove in the back office made its quiet sound. From the school down the road, Lily was in 2nd grade. She had gathered she could hear the faint, distant quality of children at recess. Daniel went back to the car, calibrating the ECU with a laptop he had connected through a port that most technicians, apparently, did not know was accessible in this model and configuration. She told him, after a while, what she had been building toward for the last 2 days, without fully acknowledging it to herself. She said that Sterling Prestige Motors was expanding to 2 new markets, and that she was looking for a chief technical officer, someone who would not merely manage service operations, but would build the technical intelligence of the entire organization. She described the compensation, the equity, the resources. She described a dedicated facility, staffed and equipped, with complete autonomy over technical standards, and the authority to reject any car that didn't meet them. She said she had spoken to 3 candidates before coming to Colorado. She said she was no longer interested in the other 3. Daniel listened to all of this without interruption. When she finished, he was still looking at the laptop screen. He typed something, waited for the system to respond, read the result. Then he looked at her. I bring Lily lunch every Tuesday, he said. The school's 4 minutes from here. He said this without hostility, without apology. In the same register as everything else, he said as information about how things are. Victoria opened her mouth and found she had no immediate response. This was not an experience she was familiar with. She had made offers to people before, job offers, equity offers, the kind of proposition that people in her industry considered transformative, and those conversations had always followed a recognizable structure. Interest concealed as evaluation, evaluation resolving into negotiation, negotiation concluding in some form of agreement. This conversation had not followed that structure. It had arrived at its conclusion before the negotiation began, via a sentence about school lunch and a distance measured in minutes rather than miles. She sat with it for a moment. The afternoon light through the high garage window had gone long and pale, the way winter light does in the mountains around 3 o'clock, thinning toward the cold blue of early dark. She thought about what it meant to turn down what she had offered. She thought about it not as a professional matter she would find her chief technical officer. There were capable people in the world, but as a human fact. Daniel Mercer had been, by Sophie's account, and by the evidence of 11 years in Stuttgart, and the particular quality of what he had done this past week, someone whose gifts were genuinely rare, the kind of gifts that, in the world Victoria operated in, were treated as obligations, obligations to deploy, to maximize, to scale. She had built her entire argument around this logic. You have something exceptional, therefore you owe it to the possible. And Daniel had declined this argument in 4 words about a school 4 minutes away. It was not laziness, and it was not failure of ambition. It was a different answer to a question she had assumed everyone answered the same way. She did not press further. She had learned enough in 7 days in that garage to understand that pressing was the wrong instrument for this particular situation. The DB11 was ready on a Wednesday morning. Daniel drove it himself in a slow circuit of the county road that ran past the garage and the school and the diner and back, 10 minutes in total, listening. Victoria watched from the open bay door, her breath visible in the cold air. When he pulled back into the lane and got out and handed her the key, he said, "It's good." 2 words. Victoria drove it herself, a longer circuit, onto the state highway and back, and the car was there was no more precise word for it transformed. Not because it was different, but because it was what it had always been before whatever moment the sensor had failed. The V12 moved through its gears with a fluency that was almost musical, the kind of mechanical harmony that is easy to take for granted until its absence teaches you what it was. The transmission did not hesitate, did not slip, did not introduce a single moment of doubt into the relationship between input and response. It was simply correct. She drove it to the airport and loaded it onto a transport to New York. Richard Holloway received the car on a Thursday, 2 days before Christmas, delivered to his Westchester residence by a Sterling Prestige Motors driver in a company-branded carrier. Victoria was not present for the delivery. She had other things to manage, but she was in her office when Richard called, and she answered. He said the car was beautiful. He said it drove like a dream. He asked, with the slightly formal politeness of a man who already knows the answer matters, who fixed it? Victoria thought for a moment about how to answer this. She thought about the 5 estimates on her legal pad. She thought about a wooden chair and bad coffee, and a child with 2 uneven braids who had said her drawing looked like a dog that was trying. She said, "Someone I trust." Richard was quiet for a beat, the particular beat of a man recalibrating a perception, and then he said, "The contract terms you proposed in October. I'm prepared to sign." Victoria said she would have the documents sent over. After the call ended, she sat still for a moment in the quiet of her office. Snow was coming down outside again, the early evening kind, soft and unhurried. She thought about something Richard had said just before he hung up. He had said he was curious about the shop that had done the work. Said he might have some other pieces he'd want seen to. Victoria had told him the garage was small, very specialized, not easy to get to. Richard had made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and acknowledgement, and said, "The best ones never are where you expect to look." Victoria had agreed, and meant it, and said goodbye. 3 nights later, Victoria Sterling drove west out of Denver in the dark and the cold, and found herself on Winter Creek Road before she had quite decided she was going there. She told herself she had additional paperwork to discuss. She told herself it was a courtesy call, a professional follow-through. She did not entirely believe herself, but she had the habit of completing the journey before interrogating the reasons for it. So she drove. The road was quiet at this hour, no other headlights. The pines on either side, holding the night close. She turned into the lane and drove slowly, without purpose or destination, until she reached the garage. The bays were dark. Both overhead doors were down, and the garage itself was closed for the night, with the settled, unequivocal quality of a building that does not apologize for its hours. But the small house attached to the garage's far end, she had not looked carefully at it before, had clocked it as a structure without attending to its details, was lit from within, a warm and specific amber visible through a kitchen window and through the gap of a curtain not quite pulled shut. Victoria stopped the car but did not get out. She sat with the engine idling. Through the window, at a distance of perhaps 30 feet, and through the falling snow that had started again, light and deliberate, she could see a kitchen table. Daniel was at the table with his back partially to the window, and Lily was across from him, visible fully her dark braids, her sweater, both hands moving as she talked, animating something she was clearly telling, with great commitment and detail. She was talking the way children talk when they have been waiting all day to say something, and have finally arrived at the moment of saying it. Daniel was leaning forward slightly on his elbows, and he was listening the way that very few people listen to anything, with his whole body oriented toward her, with no division of attention, with no device in his hand, and no part of his mind retrieving something else. He was simply there, in the particular way that presence, real presence, the kind that requires choosing it, is one of the rarest things one person can offer another. Victoria sat in the idling car in the snow and watched this for perhaps a minute. She was aware of something she could not immediately name and did not try to. It was not envy, exactly. And it was not regret. And it was not sadness, though it was adjacent to all three. It was something quieter and more honest than any of those words. The sensation of seeing a thing that is clearly right in the way that very few things are clearly anything. She had built, over 20 years, something genuinely impressive. She had worked at a standard that required sacrifices she had made without resentment, because she had believed in the work and had been right to believe in it. She had not built what she saw through that window. She did not know precisely what she would do with this information, or whether she would do anything with it at all. She was not the kind of person who translated private reckonings into immediate action and she was skeptical of the kind of clarity that arrives in a single moment. But she registered it, clearly and without argument, the way she registered things that were true and that needed to be held somewhere before they could be understood. She took out her phone and opened her contacts. She found the number she had saved after the first day in the garage, listed simply as the area code and digits with no name attached. She edited the entry. She typed, "Daniel Mercer, do not call late." Then, she put the phone in her coat pocket. She did not knock on the door. There was nothing she needed to say, and she had learned, in a cold garage in Colorado over 7 unexpected days, that the difference between what needs to be said and what wants to be said is the difference between precision and noise. She had also learned, or perhaps remembered, since some things are not discoveries but retrievals of what a person always knew, and gradually stopped attending to that the markers she had spent 2 decades calibrating as indicators of a life going well were measurements of velocity rather than of place. How fast, how much, how far. She had been excellent at all 3. She had been so excellent at all 3 that she had not noticed, until a child with a stuffed rabbit offered her a pencil, and the word Thursday had passed in a single garage in a mountain town without her phone ringing more than twice, that there were other measurements she had allowed to lapse. She put the car in reverse and backed slowly down the lane. The fresh snow filled her tire tracks behind her as she went, unhurried and quiet, and by the time she reached Winter Creek Road, the lane was smooth again, as though no one had passed through. Outside, the snow kept falling on Winter Creek, and on the dark pines, and on the corrugated roof of Mercer Garage, and on the warm window where a child was still talking, and a man was still listening, and for the first time in many years, Victoria Sterling drove home through the winter dark and felt the particular silence that is not loneliness, but the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for, something still and unhurried and her own.